Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be returning to the Capstone presentations here of our Mount Vernon Leadership Fellows. If it's not apparent for those of you who've already been watching here and at home or at work, the 16 fellows here are incredibly bright individuals, but I think they're even more amazing is their civic virtue as demonstrated through these capstone projects. So we've heard 7 here in the morning. We're hearing 9 more this afternoon and some great work that's been done. So first one to kick it off in the afternoon is John Kaufmann, who has a project on child soldiers. Good luck, John.
Thank you. Hi guys, I'm Jonathan Kaufmann, and today I'm going to be talking about improving economic assistance for former child soldiers. So the first thing I want to say right off the bat is that we have very strong evidence that these economic assistance programs, which are meant to provide jobs, actually don't do it. So they don't work. And for that reason, I'm trying to produce actionable research that will result in policy changes, that will result in improvements in these programs, hopefully getting these children jobs. So that's my objective, and it's a little bit different than what people before me have done. So how we're doing going through the presentation, first I'm going to talk about how I became involved in the issue. Then I'm going to talk about background information, scope of the problem, the research that I've done, and lastly, the next steps, the action plan that I'm taking. So how I became involved. I took a class about 1.5 years ago called Justice in Children, and it was about primarily what I came to know as victim perpetrators, people who are victims of crimes but also perpetrate them. And child soldiers are a classic example of this, people who are victims of abuse but also commit some of the worst atrocities in war. Now on the left, or on the right there, excuse me, you can see Dominic Ongwen. How many of you have seen the video Kony 2012? All right, most of you. It was about an individual named Joseph Kony who runs the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. This is actually where the data that I'm using for my research comes from. And he was particularly prolific in his use of child soldiers. He used about 60,000 child soldiers over the course of his battle with Uganda. And he's still at large today, and he caused massive problems with the civilian population. Dominic Ongwen was one of the 4 commanders right underneath him. He, the other 3 commanders, and Joseph Kony were all indicted by the International Criminal Court for the use of child soldiers, particularly but war crimes and crimes against humanity. And he's sitting in trial at the ICC today. He's actually the only person ever indicted by the ICC for the crimes that were committed against him, because he was a former child soldier, and he recruited children for use in combat. He was abducted between the ages of 10 and 14 and was part of the LRA for 21 to 25 years before he was eventually captured and brought to the ICC. And so when I was thinking about him and whether or not he should be held accountable for his crimes, because after all, he was just 10 when he was abducted, I came into contact with this idea of DDR, which is disarmament, demobilization, reintegration. And it's the process by which we take somebody from an armed group and bring them back into society. And a huge part of this is getting them jobs so that they can provide for themselves, be productive members of their community. And so economic assistance, the reason why it's important is because it's an essential part of DDR, right? It's essential to bringing people back into society. And economic assistance helps people get jobs. It's the primary objective. And one of the reasons that's so essential is that it lowers recidivism. So people who don't have jobs are much more likely to pick up a gun again and fight again. And so getting people jobs helps to end the cycle of conflict, and it helps to prevent conflict from continuing. In other words, it increases regional stability, and that's essential. So before I go any further, I should probably address the question, what is a child soldier? Under international law, a child soldier is any person under the age of 15. That's what a child is defined as. You might say, why not 18? Well, actually, it's international law. We allow people who are age 17 to join our military, and England allows people as young as 16 to join their military, under 15. And then they have to be associated with armed forces. These are not necessarily people with guns. A child soldier could include people who are porters, cooks, or even water boys, anybody associated with armed forces. And I want to make something clear. Some people talk about volunteers under that age. There's no such thing as volunteering under 15. If you're a volunteer, it doesn't matter. Recruiting of any sort of people under 15 is illegal under international law. And one major group that a lot of people actually don't know recruited from child soldiers is ISIS. ISIS uses what they call caliphate cubs. And they're people who volunteer to be part of ISIS. And that's a big problem. So how big is the problem? Well, there's an estimated 300,000 former child soldiers in conflict today. My university is just 7,000 people. Think about how large your university is, and think about how large 300,000 people are. They're in 19 different countries, primarily in South America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And they're used by 86 different groups, including governments of some of these countries. So DDR fits into this larger process of post-conflict recovery, right? We talk about ending conflict, preventing conflict, but what happens when everybody lays down their arms? They come home to destroyed economies, destroyed infrastructures. You can see that road on the side is completely destroyed and the vehicle is partially overturned. Nobody's using that for a truck. Nobody's using that for resources. And there's massive amounts of people displaced all over the country. So when you go into these environments, you ask what people really want. People provide food, water, shelter. What they really want is jobs. And right here you can see a transcript, an interview with a former child soldier. And ask, if we could give you one thing, what would you want? And he says, I need a job. There's no jobs here. Right? And he goes on to talk about how when they leave and they provide food and water, but when people leave, they take all that stuff with them. And so the sustainable form of assistance is getting people jobs, because it's kind of that old bring a man a fish, teach a man to fish adage, because it's sustainable. So what gives you a job according to economics, right? Things like work experience, right? If you guys have all been in the job market, you know you need work experience, you need education. And one thing we don't really talk about is mother's education. Actually, mother's education is a huge window to the opportunities that people have. When you talk about mother's education, women are more likely, especially in developing countries, to spend the extra income they earn from their education on improving their families and their communities. And when a father's more educated, they're much more likely to actually spend that money on themselves. It's well documented that they tend to drink the money away or use it to buy meat for themselves, things like that. So women's education is a much better metric. And so all of these contribute to skills and knowledge, and this is the idea of human capital. Human capital theory was developed by Mintz and Becker, and if you want a little light reading, that's some of their essays on the side in their books. But these programs have been largely unsuccessful. So what have they been doing? Well, they've been providing microloans, things that you have probably heard about, providing money to people to start up. But among former child soldiers, the repayment rate is lower than 5%. So it's very unsuccessful. They provide vocational training. Over there you can see a woman being trained to be a hairdresser. There's actually this very famous example where they trained 200 women, female former child soldiers, to be hairdressers. Now, when these people went out into the market, it completely destroyed the market for hairdressers, because you don't need 200 hairdressers in a single camp. And all the people who were already hairdressers lost their jobs, and all these people couldn't get jobs. Lastly, education. And we can kind of understand why education doesn't work when you think about somebody who's been abducted at age 8. They've been in conflict for 5 years. They come back at age 13, and the government says you have to go back into a classroom with 8-year-olds. Nobody's going to do it. So it just doesn't work. So when we think about this, they've all given skills and knowledge, all these programs have, but they're still unsuccessful. So why don't they work? One is that microloans don't provide skills training. So you might have the physical capital to start a business, but you don't know how to do it. So if you don't know how to build a business, it doesn't matter if you have the money to do it. You're not going to be able to. When vocational training programs are there, they don't have any market analysis, right? They could have known that they couldn't put 200 extra barbers into an economy. And they could have said, we need this many barbers, we need this many weavers, we need this many cobblers. They didn't do that, and that's really important. There's also a lack of data, so there's a lack of evaluations of these programs and whether or not they actually work, and more of the data is indicating they don't. And there's also a lack of research on improvements. And one more thing is that the research primarily points out problems, but it doesn't really include solutions. And academics like to point out a lot of problems, but don't include solutions. But this is one thing that's a big problem, because all of the research is focusing on the problem, not the solution. So what's the research question I'm proposing to answer? It's how distress, psychological distress, impacts employment and income, or labor market outcomes. And so my hypothesis is that as psychological distress goes up, income goes down. It's pretty simple. So the data I'm using is from Survey for War-Affected Youth SWAY, Phase 1, and it was conducted in Uganda in 2006 in that red region up there. That's the sampling area. And it includes 462 former child soldiers, 167 of which are unemployed completely. It's 25% unemployment rate. It's pretty high, but keep in mind it doesn't include people whose only form of employment is odd jobs. So How is distress measured? It's measured via symptoms of distress, not whether or not they have PTSD, because we don't have the contextual evidence to say this many symptoms of distress equals PTSD. It's different between contexts. So it's gauged on a scale of 0 to 15. The median is 4 symptoms, and the 90th percentile and higher, the top 10%, exhibit 8 or more symptoms. So income is measured in a logarithmic function. It's basically changes in the income by percentage. So basically, the way that we say this is each symptom of distress results in an X% change in income. So an extra year of education, for example, would result in a 2% rise in income or a 3% rise in income. And an additional, let's say, a disability would result in a reduction of 3% of income. It's very standard in economics. So control variables we're including are work experience, education, mother's education, marital status, violent experiences, abduction length and abduction age, and also whether or not they're displaced in a refugee camp. So the method that I'm using is called the Heckman selection model, and it solved this problem. So we can say that when somebody's employed, they make a certain amount of money, right? But when you're not employed, we say you make $0, but that doesn't really work, because if you were in the labor market, then you would be making presumably more money than $0, right? So we have to evaluate first whether or not you're employed, and then we can evaluate your income. So we do this via a probit model, which basically says this variable affects your likelihood of being employed. So if you have more education, you're more likely to be employed. If you're disabled, you're less likely to be employed. And then once we know you're employed, we can evaluate via a regression model how your income stacks up. So if you have more education, you make more money. If you have less education, you make less money. So the results. We can answer 2 questions. How does distress impact chances of employment? And how does distress impact your income if you're employed? Well, distress has no significant relationship with your chances of employment. It doesn't change that at all. But it does change your income. So if you do work and you have high levels of distress, it will significantly reduce your income. This is a 95% significance level. We're very, very confident that this is true. So how big is the impact? It's minus 7% of your total income per symptom. So if we think again to the scale of 0 to 14, median is 4. The 90th percentile is 8 symptoms. So at the 90th percentile, they're getting 28% less income than people at the average. So if you can think about it, 72% of the total income, which is already incredibly low. The average income is actually below the poverty line in these areas. So what's the conclusion? The main conclusion is that distress impacts earnings, obviously, and that a lot of people have proposed that if we increase people's economic opportunity, will improve their psychosocial outcome. This actually proposes the opposite, that if we increase people's psychosocial outcomes, if we focus on this distress, we'll improve their economic opportunity at the same time. And this is kind of a new idea. Second, treating distress is essential to increasing people's economic opportunity. And we kind of already know how to treat distress, how to treat psychological issues. So the first one is through cleansing ceremonies, through ritual cleansings and reconciliatory justice processes called Matu Oput in Uganda, and they're throughout different contexts, where people are forgiven for their crimes. And this will decrease their levels of distress. We also know that psychological counseling does work, and that community and familial support really does improve distress. So when a parent is more understanding, or when people are participating in church groups or drama clubs or volunteering, this helps their distress levels. So what are suggested improvements to programs? Very simply, integrate the psychosocial and the economic assistance that's offered. Work it all together, right? Look at the child in a more holistic fashion so that we know that improving any of these various areas will really improve the total outcome. Second, perform market analysis on vocational training. Talked about that a lot before. Integrating business training with microloans. There's a very famous example of a few women, female former child soldiers, who were given money to start a restaurant. And when they first started, people were stealing money from the business. They were feeding their families for free. And after they received business skills training and they worked with a few of the NGO individuals to improve their business, they ended up being the most profitable business in their community. Lastly, collecting data to offer evaluations and improvements. So what are the next steps? Well, the end goal is to get the improvements implemented with the programs, and the only way to do that is to influence these public organizations, UNICEF, USAID, and local organizations to make these happen. And the way to do that is to speak with their leaders, speak with their policymakers, and so that's kind of one next step, but also to influence the scholarly debate, which does influence these public organizations. And the way to do that, obviously, is publishing research. So these are my two goals, publishing research and speaking with the organizations. But success for me would be implementing these improvements. Long-term goals are to influence the public organizations and influence the scholarly debate. And then the short-term goals are to speak with leaders and policymakers and also publish this research in a journal. So some of the challenges that are upcoming, obviously, is writing the paper. Producing knowledge is a time-intensive process. Writing paper is a very time-intensive process. And writing it to a quality that would get it published in a reputable journal, which brings me to my next point. Getting it published is a whole other issue, very difficult, and is also extremely time-intensive. So those are two of the main challenges that I see. And those will help build credibility if I get it published. But lastly, a third challenge is just connecting with leaders in the field. And I already do have some connections to them, but getting the research published would build more connections and build credibility. So that's my projects. Do you have any questions? Yes?
What are the journals that you're looking to publish in?
I think I'll evaluate that after I write the paper.
When did you do the research?
I did it this summer, so in the last few weeks. Yeah. Yes.
So it's really interesting to talk about, the economic security these soldiers need.
Right.
I'm just kind of curious, even the jobs available, do these children tend to hesitate, that decision to leave, they face backlash from that? And I know, a lot of children may depend not just on their economic security, but their physical security
Mm-hmm.
too. So is that an issue you run into, that if the child, even the jobs available, that decision to leave in itself might be a huge obstacle?
Right, so one of the main issues is community sensitization. The group's already working on this, so I'm trying to go into it. No real economic knowledge has been produced yet, and so this is kind of a different thing that hasn't really been touched on very heavily, and so a lot of people are working on that side, and I'm trying to work in another area. But it is an issue. What have they found? They've implemented community sensitization efforts in Uganda and in Sierra Leone that have been extremely effective, primarily because in Sierra Leone, people were on drugs when they committed most of the crimes. They gave children cocaine and other addictive substances. And then in Uganda, nobody volunteered. All of these children were abducted. So that made it much easier to integrate them back into society. Are there any other questions? No? All right, well, thank you.